Next, here in the UK, the government will announce plans to fast-track the deportation of illegal migrants as part of a sweeping reforms of the UK's asylum policy. It comes after the Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, told the BBC that illegal immigration was tearing the country apart. Well, she made the comments as she shared further details of changes to the system. So, under the new proposal, asylum seekers will only be able to stay for 2.5 years before being reassessed, instead of the current 5. At the moment, after 5 years, people can apply for permanent residence, but the new plans will require them to wait 20 years before being allowed to do that.
Yep. All right. So we'll say, she's absolutely right about immigration tearing the UK apart. And I think this comes way too late. I will get into why it has come so late, particularly in the UK, because I think the UK is, I think it's absolutely in the shitter right now. You see enormous protests going on in the UK, and there's a lot of violence surrounding it. And I think it's been handled absolutely terrible by Keir Starmer and the Labour government. I think, they waged war on free speech, arresting people for tweets that they make. I think that's ludicrous. But I think this is going to be a good policy, because basically they are saying, all right, well, we're going to halve the amount of time you can stay here as a sort of temporary asylum seeker, right? So before it was 5 years, now it's going to be 2.5. So every 2.5 years, they have to be reassessed. And then they quadrupled the amount of time you have to stay there before you can apply for permanent residence, right? So before, you could essentially come from a country that, all right, it allowed you to seek asylum in the UK, and you only had to be reassessed once, and then you could apply for permanent residence. Now you have to apply, and you have to be assessed to be a valid asylum seeker 8 times, right, before you can actually apply for permanent residence. I think that's a good thing. It's going to increase the amount of barriers that there are to permanent residents, and that will make it harder to become a British citizen, or at least a British resident.
However, the government says there will be ways to apply to live here permanently earlier if people use safe and legal routes to arrive and if they're working and contributing to society. Also plans to overhaul how human rights legislation is applied in migration cases.
Yeah, all right. That last point about legal routes, I will look at that later on. I will look at one of the UK statements, the government statement on this new policy. Um, but it has to be done the right way in order to avoid abuse, because obviously in the past a lot of immigrants came on student visas, and then they just dropped out of their studies after a couple of months and began working illegally, or either got a working visa. So it has to be done the right way.
Well, this comes as the latest figures on migrant crossings in small boats found that the nearly 600 people who arrived over the week to Saturday brought the total for the year to
Yes,
nearly 39,300.
that's crazy.
That's up by nearly a fifth on this time last year. But just
This is insane, because these are the way they present them and the way I understand it. These are only the boat crossings, and the boat crossings, they're not even the majority, right? They're the minority. It's like a very small part of immigration into the UK is actually by these migrant crossings, and it's 40,000 year to date. The year isn't even over, and it's already at 40,000. That's insane.
behind the level we saw at this stage in 2022, which was the peak year so far.
It's very
Joe Clark
concerning.
has more.
The sound of protests on the issue of immigration have been heard for months. Yesterday in Crowborough, East Sussex, people were opposing plans to house male asylum seekers at a nearby army camp. And the Home Secretary believes there are similar stories across the UK.
It is an issue that is dividing our country, and I see this polarisation all over the country, including in my own constituency. We have a system that is...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, now she starts talking about seeing it in her constituency, and that really reveals the cynical approach to uh, politics that the Labour Party has, and because it's about votes, right? So I think, in my opinion, it's about the system you have for voting and getting seats in the UK. It's called first past the post, which is essentially that each seat, is represented by a constituency, and so it's just whoever gets the majority of votes in that constituency gets the seat, and that creates a much different dynamic during elections. So I just wanted to show this is the election results from 2024, where the Labour Party, you can see here, they won 412 seats out of, I believe it's 650 seats in the UK Parliament. But if we scroll down here, you can see they only received 34% of the vote, and they got these 412 seats. That's about 70%, maybe 2/3 of all the seats, right? So there's a massive discrepancy in how many votes they got and how many seats they got. You can also see some of these geographical parties. The Sinn Féin, that's I believe the Welsh. No, actually, I'm wrong about that. That's the Northern Irish party, right? So it's geographically bound. So in the region of Northern Ireland, they're going to have quite a high vote count. So they're going to be getting the seats, but they don't actually get any votes probably in the rest of the UK, right? So they get the seats because their votes are concentrated on constituents. But if you scroll down and see Reform UK, they got 14% of the vote, and they only got 5 seats. That is a consequence of this first past the post system, because the Reform UK party isn't actually geographically locked, right? Like a Scottish Independence Party, Welsh Independence Party, Northern Irish Independence Party. It is distributed fairly equally across the entire UK, with the exception probably of large cities like London, which are going to be traditionally more pro-immigration, right? So it's dispersed fairly evenly across the entirety of the UK. So even though they had a massive 14% vote share, they only got 5 seats. And that's actually why I believe this system has led the Labour Party to not actually be responsive to the unrest in the public with immigration, because this this first past the post system, it creates a threshold, right, like this, and the amount of people, let's say the amount of people in 2019, right, that believed or that found immigration policy to be quite important, right? That may have been something like this, 20%, right? That's not going to get you any seats. It might get you a lot of votes, right? Like we saw with the Reform UK, but it's not going to get you a lot of seats. Then it gets even worse, right? Like this. Many more people think now it's absolutely terrible. And we could say this is maybe 2024, right? So last year. And maybe this will hit something like 29%, right? It's not above the threshold. So in this situation, maybe Labour, they'll be on about 70% of the seats here, right? And this shift, maybe they'll lose a constituent or two, so they'll maybe go to 69% of the seats, right? it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme because they still have a vast majority. But now, 2025, what happens? It just creeps above that threshold. Sorry. 2025. It creeps just above, right? Maybe it hits, we'll just say 31%. Now, 31% of people, they feel so strongly about immigration policy and wanting to restrict the amount of immigration into the country that they are willing to vote elsewhere, to maybe on a party that doesn't share their remaining core beliefs, just because the importance of immigration policy grows so much. But now, just these 2%, right? These 2% in voter behavior, they're maybe going to reflect something like they're going to reflect a massive decrease because it grows above the threshold of this first past the post system. So maybe this would leave Labour with 30% of the seats if there were to be an election, right? So that's how it works, because maybe you're going to have constituents. If we take on the left over here, right, you have one constituency which is just very pro immigration, right? And then that could be London, right? And then you have a lot of other ones where it's about it's about, say, 20%, 19%, 21%, right? They go on and on and on and on, right? Labour are still going to win. They're still going to win in all of these constituencies because not enough people actually vote for the other parties. Then as soon as it gets above this threshold, then you're going to see constituencies where, all right, well, it's 30, 31, 33, and they're still going to win, right? They're still going to win maybe one where it's just 28, just slightly lower than all the other ones. But they're going to be losing on so many constituencies. And that's why I think we've seen this threshold being met. And I think the reason that the Labour Party hasn't actually reacted any quicker is, I think if they're very stupid, it's because they didn't think that threshold was going to be breached, right? I don't think anybody could deny that that was going to happen. Or maybe it's just because they're too stupid to do it before they actually lost all the other votes, right? Yeah, I mean, I might as well just show you this poll, right? It's a poll, so it's not an election or anything, and it's probably going to differ a bit. But you can see here, Labour winning 34% of the vote, right? And they get 70% of the seats in the parliament. And now, just in this April, they sort of equalise with Reform UK. But now, Reform UK is on 30% of votes, right? And Labour is absolutely, I mean, demolished, right, on 18% of votes. And so I think that just the sort of value proposition, right, of anti-immigration policy has shifted for Labour, because now I think probably Labour could go anti-immigration, and they could, even if they lost all of their 18% of voters they currently have, I think they would be better off, because they would cannibalize on anti-immigration issue voters from Reform UK, Conservatives, and all the other parties that actually agree with Labour on many of the other core policies, but just find that immigration policy is so important, right? So I think that's what's happened. I think it's happened way too late. But I also don't think that actually that these politicians care about immigration policy, I don't think necessarily that that's a bad thing. It's just a marketplace democracy where the politicians, they sell you the policies that you want, and I think that's fine as long as they actually act on it and provide the policy that the people want, that they sold them on during campaigning, right? So just wanted to show you that, explain that, and then
It's out of control, it's unfair, and it's putting huge pressure on communities.
Today, the Home Secretary will announce she's overhauling human rights law to make deporting illegal migrants easier. She plans to change the law so those refused asylum can't make multiple appeals. And Shabana Mahmood will also threaten visa bans on 3 African countries, Namibia, Angola and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, unless they start accepting the return of thousands of their criminals and illegal immigrants.
Absolutely. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because you don't want to have these states just sort of ship off their problems to the UK. I mean, without any consequences. That's honestly, I think it's insane that these 3 countries haven't been accepting refugees, and it hasn't actually had any consequences until now. But it's good to see. Good to see.
Unless they start accepting the return of thousands of their criminals and illegal immigrants. The Home Office has for decades been seen as a political poison chalice, full of pitfalls and dangers. Shabana Mahmood's team hope this plan, which they argue is comprehensive and common sense, will avoid all of those. But there are already sceptics in the Labour Party. Folkestone MP Tony Vaughan has tweeted, "The Prime Minister said in September that we are at a fork in the road. These asylum proposals suggest we have taken the wrong turning.
No.
The idea that recognised refugees need to be deported is wrong. We absolutely need immigration controls, and where those controls decide to grant asylum, we should welcome and integrate, not create perpetual limbo and alienation."
This won't necessarily be the silver bullet, and I think the government recognises that. It's taking a quite broad approach. It's also focusing on enforcement, focusing on return deals. This is unlikely to be on its own a silver bullet that reduces small boat arrivals substantially. But is it a part of a broader strategy? Yes. Will people know about these kinds of restrictions such that it will deter them in large numbers? We'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, I mean, I think this guy, I think he's mostly right about what he's saying. It's not going to actually, this in itself is not going to make the problem go away. It's just the sort of the beginning of what has to be done. But I think it will have a deterrent. I think the UK government should take a page out of the Danish government's books, which was when they restricted or announced a lot of restrictive policies on immigrants and their social benefits. They actually advertised it in Arabic countries in newspapers and so on. And I think that would be a reasonable strategy for the UK government to do.
As the Home Secretary prepares to sell her plans to Parliament, both the Conservatives and Reform UK have expressed doubts as to whether these proposals will ever get through the Commons. Joe Pike, BBC News, Westminster.
And we go live to Westminster now. Our chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman, is standing by. Hi, Henry. We're going to hear more details in Parliament.
I will say, the doubt about whether it will get through the Commons, I think that's a matter of time, right? Because if you stand against these, the longer that British MPs are going to be denying immigration policy, restricting immigration policy, it's just going to radicalize more people, and more people are going to be moving towards the extreme anti-immigration parties like Reform UK, right? And so it's just, it's a do it now or lose your seat, and it will be done by someone else, right? That's the sort of problem being faced. So I think it's a nice dynamic to see this proposal.
Parliament later. What do you make of what we've heard so far?
Well, it is undeniably a very extensive package. In the government's eyes, the most extensive reforms to the asylum system in the UK for decades. And I think the fact that there's such an extensive package with so many different measures in it means that
I will say, I think it's fair to say it's extensive relative to what the UK government has done, because the UK government hasn't really done anything. So any policy would be extensive. It's not a like a broad or relative to what's been done in Denmark or other countries. It's not actually that big a deal, I think.
There's going to be a lot for MPs to digest, and critically, a lot that Labour MPs from Shabana Mahmood's own side could potentially object to, as you were hearing from Joe there. I think important to stress that the unease, and I don't put it more strongly than that, but the unease with these plans within the Labour Party is not confined to the left of the Labour Party, not confined to the wing of the Labour Party, which pretty much objects to the direction of travel on every policy area from this government. There are people who might more typically ally themselves with Keir Starmer or with Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, who are a bit unsure about these plans, do wonder whether they go too far. So I think Shabana Mahmood's task in the House of Commons later today isn't just to put a parliamentary flavour on what we've seen her announce over the last few days. It is also to win over some wavering Labour MPs.
And what about...
I think this is, doubtful. I don't know if he really means that. It's also, I mean, I think you also have to view this is the BBC News, right? So of course they're going to push a more sort of traditionally left-leaning perspective, right? So, but I think, as I said before, I think it's just going to be a matter of time. Is it going to be now, or is it going to be after the next election, right? So it's not really that problematic.
Any assessment about how effective these measures will or won't be?
Well, it's important to say that the measures are not going to be retrospective, so they won't affect the people who are already here under the existing system. And obviously, much of the frustration that we've seen on the...
I will say, though, you will actually have to, even though this isn't going to be retrospective, I would say in order to actually get to the root of the problem in the UK, you will have to do some sort of retrospective deportations, right? That could be, say, if you are convicted of any violent crime, any sort of unforced error, then you get deported, right? I mean, I think you just have to do it because even now, even if you stopped all immigration into the UK, I think the UK is still at a breaking point. There's too many immigrants. It's too big a problem for them to just say, right, if you got here, you can stay. That doesn't make any sense.
Streets, as well as in our politics over the past year or two at illegal immigration as it stands, is by definition about the situation as it stands. So I think, Shabana Mahmood is going to have to find a way to make an argument about why that is the case for those to her right. For those to her left, the argument that she will make, I think, is that the effectiveness that she hopes these measures will have is not just an end in and of itself, but is also in order to rebuild public confidence in the asylum system. I'm told the argument that she's been making privately to Labour MPs, and we may well hear her make in public in the House of Commons later today, is that in order to have the safe and legal routes for asylum seekers, which so many in the Labour Party and other political parties generally on the left of politics prize, you have to have public confidence in the asylum system, and she believes these measures are necessary to attain that.
Okay.
I mean, I think, of course, you have to have public confidence in the government and in the asylum system, obviously, right? But I don't think that's actually what it's about. I just think it's a very cynical approach to, policy and maintaining and increasing the power of the Labour Party. And it's a fair thing to say, right? I mean, it's vote-seeking behavior. They want more votes. They're probably going to get more votes with this policy. That's fair. That's probably somewhat of an optimal democracy. But it is I think there's a lot of dishonesty in how you actually in how they sort of frame this policy, right? I mean, I think it's also fair to say, all right, well, the people want a stricter immigration policy, we'll give it to them, right? And I will also say, in the case of Denmark, where the Social Democratic Party actually crushed the far right anti-immigration parties, that if you want to represent the workers and the working class, or even the middle class, you have to be tough on immigration, because those are the classes that are most undermined by immigrants, bringing decreases to wages for low-skilled jobs, right? So it's a no-brainer.
Henry, thank you very much for that. We're going to speak now to Associate Professor of Political Science at Aarhus University, Christina Bakker-Simonsen. Thank you very much for coming on the programme.
Yeah, of course.
So we're hearing, or we have heard certainly, a lot about the Denmark model here, the Labour Party in the UK trying to model some of these changes on what's happened in Denmark, a tougher approach to the whole system. Is the Denmark model a good model for the UK to try and copy?
Well, of course, that depends on the policy goals that one wants to achieve. But it's definitely correct to say that the Danish model is considered one of the most restrictive, if not the most restrictive in Europe when it comes to asylum, permanent residency, and naturalization, and also the measures that are taken for immigrants in the country.
I mean, she's absolutely right. She's actually a professor at my university. She does a very good job. But I don't think it's a coincidence that the BBC actually invited her on, because I do believe, like many professors obviously working at universities, that she is more of a left-leaning, and you can hear that in how she sort of talks about this. But I will say what she's getting at, and she is right to say that it is a very restrictive policy that we have seen in Denmark. But the policy in Denmark, the immigration policy, has been extremely successful. I think probably she will maybe get more into that.
And in terms of what those policies have sort of delivered in terms of policy outcomes, what we see is that the reduced welfare benefits that immigrants or asylum seekers receive have led those groups into poverty and increased rates of petty crime, and also poorer outcomes in school for the children of refugees. And more generally, these messages also heard by immigrants who have lived long-term in Denmark, including their children. So we see that this type of rhetoric that also accompanies the restrictive policies have led to lower levels of political trust, lower levels of democracy.
I mean, I will say she's in specifically what she says, that is true, right? That you have this is sort of also the policies that I talked about earlier that were actually advertised in Arabic newspapers, that social benefits for immigrants were cut. And this has had an adverse effect on those immigrants that actually came and suffered under that. But it has had a very positive effect on the, you could say, the deterrence, right? So I think, just framing this as just purely a bad thing, I think is quite dishonest, because it actually negates all the positive effects, right? So if you look at sort of the the pool of immigrants, right, under restrictive, so this is restrictive immigration policies, and let's say this is a less restrictive, right? Less restrictive, it's going to be a much larger pool. So under this restrictive policy, she says, all right, well, yes, but the initial amount, right, of sort of criminal offenses, let's say it would be this much, right? Maybe 10, 15%. It's a bit higher than average, but not drastically, right? And then you sort of implement restrictive policy, and then that sort of increases a bit, right? So it increases just a little bit. And she says, well, that's a failure of the policy, right? But she doesn't actually touch on the fact that instead of having this as the outcome, then you just have this entire pool from a much larger, so the percentage is going to be about the same, of the pool, but because the pool is so much larger, it's going to have a much bigger impact, right? So the crime from this group is going to be much larger from when you have the restrictive policy. So I do think, she's right and she does good research, but I don't think that it's a coincidence that the BBC invited her on to speak, because I think it was quite predictable what she was going to say. I don't blame it on her. I think it's fair to have that political opinion, but it is an opinion, and I think it just does negate the positive deterrence effects of this restrictive policy. But I do think that's about it for this
and national
video.
Belonging, even among the second generation. So these are also things to take into account when introducing such policies.
Okay, Christina Abaka-Simmonson, we'll leave it there. We've lost a bit of the light.
Yep. All right. So, I mean, it's, the BBC. I think this video actually, while it does show a lot of interesting points, it also just goes to show how the BBC kind of spins their narratives, right? So it's not that they said anything that's actually false. It's just that they provided a particular part of the truth, right? That sort of frames it in a different manner than if you actually just sort of view the overall policies. And just here in the last part, I just wanted to show you this. Oh yeah, we actually already touched on it. But yeah, I mean, you can see the Reform UK, right? So they are sitting at about 30%, roughly about where Labour was. So they're probably going to be looking at, if there was an election today, of course there's not. It's going to be quite a while before there is, maybe. You never know. But then they would probably get about the same 2/3 majority that Labour is enjoying right now. Oh yes, and this is the statement from the government: restoring order and control, a statement on the government's asylum and returns policy. So the first one here, reducing arrivals. I mean, that seems fairly straightforward, very uncontroversial. That makes sense. Increasing removals, right? Increasing deportations, also very uncontroversial and very straightforward. It just has to be done the right way. Now this, safe and legal routes, right? This is about giving, let's see this, reform refugee sponsorship to give voluntary and community sector organizations a greater role. Introduce a capped route for refugees and displaced students to study in the UK, helping talented refugees to continue their studies, realize their potential. Establish a capped route for skilled refugees and displaced people to come to the UK for work. So this sounds good, right? Essentially, it's about attracting skilled labor and talents, right? And it sounds good, but it has to be implemented in the right way, because this is a system that has been abused previously and still is, that many people come to the UK on a student visa and then they drop out of their studies and they begin to work either illegally or they are able to get a work visa, right? So you have to sort of, I think a way you can do this is if you look at Denmark, you have to make a substantial amount of money for you to be able to come to work in Denmark on a working visa. You have to make about probably somewhere around 20% more than the median household, or sorry, than the median individual income. So it sort of increases, you could say, it's a net positive for the economy. And I think another way you could do this with students is to have some sort of minimum requirement for GPA averages, right? But it's more tricky to do this one, create safe and legal routes. It's good in theory, but it has to actually also work in practice. All right, these were my thoughts on this new UK policy. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Do you think these policies are going to be successful and that this is the beginning of a better trajectory for the UK? Or do you think not, that it's just going to be from here on more of the same old, same old? If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe for more policy commentary. I'm also working currently on a video on why Denmark has been fighting the EU minimum wage bill that was actually just recently announced, so be on the lookout for that. Thanks for watching.